Both sides nearly killed them as an enslaved crew steered a Confederate transport through Charleston Harbor, carrying their families and 6 artillery pieces toward freedom between guns powerful enough to destroy them. At Fort Sumter, around 4:15, the planter looked perfectly ordinary, Confederate flags flying, engines steady, whistle answering correctly, while every white officer who supposedly commanded her remained asleep ashore. To understand how this vessel reached that moment, rewind through the route now appearing on our chart toward the forced harbor labor that quietly taught its crew every necessary detail they needed. The planter began as a commercial sidewheel steamer privately owned in Charleston, built for shallow coastal water rather than legend, useful because it entered places larger vessels could not. During the war, its owners leased the vessel to the Confederate Army, which used it as a dispatch and transport steamer, moving messages, supplies, soldiers, equipment and artillery across the fortified harbor. That work carried the crew repeatedly among Charleston's wharves, islands, batteries and channels, turning each routine voyage into another careful lesson about currents, signals, patrols, schedules and the daily expectations of sentries. Its shallow draft let the planter move close to shore, while sidewheels and compact machinery kept it maneuverable, giving the enslaved operators knowledge. Below deck, engineers John Small and Alfred Gourdine managed steam pressure, coal pistons and paddle wheels, expertise that kept Confederate business moving while the law treated the experts themselves as property. Above them, Robert Smalls was officially called a wheelman, a title that concealed the pilot's work he was already trusted to perform without granting the authority or freedom that work implied. Other deckhands handled lines, cargo, guns and signals, so the vessel depended on coordinated knowledge distributed across the crew, not on the isolated brilliance of one man in a heroic frame. The surviving record names: Abraham Jackson, Gabriel Turner, David Jones, Jack Gibbs, John Small, Alfred Gourdine. The Confederacy engineered a fundamental contradiction inside Charleston Harbor by denying these men autonomy while requiring their considerable expertise in operational routes. The white captain, mate and engineer repeatedly went ashore at night, leaving the enslaved crew aboard the planter, a convenient habit that violated Confederate orders and created a dangerous opening. An empty officer's berth did not equal freedom, but it removed immediate supervision, allowing steam to rise, machinery to move, and preparations to begin before anyone ashore understood what was happening. Current National Park Service research places secret planning in early May, involving regular crew members and other enslaved maritime workers who understood that the opportunity would vanish after a single mistake. Who first proposed the seizure remains disputed because later testimony challenged the single hero account, while sources agree that planning required many people, distinct skills, and coordinated family movement throughout the harbor. Stealing the vessel was only the first problem. Families had to disappear from homes, reach a hidden waiting place, board quickly, and accept that failure could bring punishment far beyond the crew. On May 12th, the planter returned to Charleston carrying 4 heavy artillery pieces in addition to 2 mounted guns, so the escape vessel now held 6 weapons intended for Confederate use. The families did not merely wait for rescue because Charles Chisholm and others helped move them to the Confederate steamer Etiwan at North Atlantic Wharf, safely concealing the group until final pickup. Records preserve Hannah Smalls, Susan Small and her infant Philip, Annie White and Lavinia Wilson more clearly than others, reminding us that participation survives unevenly across documents written for different purposes. That night, the white officers went ashore again, leaving their uniforms, habits and assumptions behind, while the crew prepared to transform an unauthorized absence into a permanent loss of ship and people. Steam had to be raised quietly and correctly, because a cold boiler would expose delay while a rushed engine could fail. John Small and Alfred Gourdine controlled the first irreversible movement. Before dawn on May 13th, the planter eased from Southern Wharf, not racing toward open water but moving first in the opposite direction, because freedom required collecting families before confronting the fort. At North Atlantic Wharf, the waiting group transferred from the Etiwan onto the planter, bundles and infant carried aboard while the charted line doubled back through a city still mostly asleep. There could be no second trip once the families stepped aboard because every engineer, deckhand, partner and parent entered the same operation, sharing consequences that no later heroic narrative could honestly separate. Inside the pilot house, the familiar version of events begins to fracture, because surviving accounts disagree about the person at the wheel, the plan's origin, and how command actually worked. Early United States reports credited Robert Smalls as pilot and leader, and later public accounts emphasized the broad straw hat that helped his silhouette resemble Captain Charles Relayer from a distance. Smalls exaggerated his command, while William Morrison publicly maintained that recognition for their collective operation had been disproportionately and controversially distributed afterward. Reconstructs shared deception. Alliston at the wheel, while Smalls copied the captain's outline and delivered expected signals, a plausible synthesis rather than a camera inside the room. The uncertainty does not weaken the escape because it reveals simultaneous labor with steering above, engineering below deck, work outside, signals carefully timed and families protected safely wherever space could be found. The pilot house was therefore not a throne but a junction, where several streams of knowledge met as the planter turned seaward and the route line approached the first defensive checkpoint. Charleston Harbor was not guarded by one dramatic fortress. It was a connected system of batteries, patrol craft, channels, islands, signals, and overlapping fields of fire designed to expose unfamiliar movement. Castle Pinckney and Fort Ripley watched the inner water where a Confederate vessel leaving at the wrong speed angle or hour could attract attention before reaching the most famous defenses farther out. Fort Johnson and patrol activity added another layer near the approach, forcing the planter to behave like an ordinary Confederate military vessel conducting business instead of fugitives steering desperately toward the horizon. Speed was dangerous. The crew kept flags visible, machinery rhythmic and movement ordinary, using the enemy's expectation of routine as carefully as they used the wheel, whistle and channel at every checkpoint. At each expected point, the whistle gave familiar signals, a simple sound carrying enormous risk because one wrong interval could reveal that the officers recognized by the forts were absent. At approximately 4:15, the planter approached Fort Sumter, where darkness, distance, silhouette flags and sound combined into the last Confederate test before open water and the blockade at the harbor entrance. The fort's report records a sentry calling that the guard boat was going out, an ordinary observation that captured the extraordinary success of the crew's performance at the decisive checkpoint. That sentry recognized the vessel, our signal and expected mission, yet failed to recognize that power aboard had changed completely. The defense system saw its own routine and trusted it. The planter continued toward Morris Island, keeping its pace while the inked route crossed the strongest field of fire, each second carrying the vessel closer to the limits of Confederate reach. By the time its movement looked wrong, the ship was passing beyond effective gun range, but clearing the fort solved only half the problem because another heavily armed fleet still waited ahead. The United States blockade had no advance notice that an enemy transport was bringing freedom seekers, artillery, newspapers and military intelligence, so the approaching planter could reasonably look like an attack. Once Confederate guns receded behind them, the crew lowered Confederate flags and raised a white flag, changing the vessel's meaning while remaining dangerously far from anyone able to read the cloth. The earliest official report calls it a white flag. Later accounts remember a bedsheet. The exact fabric is uncertain, but the improvised signal and the peril surrounding it are not. Some blockading ships began moving away from what they feared might be a Confederate attack, widening the distance just as the planter needed its new signal to become unmistakably visible. The sailing ship Onward remained in the channel and opened its gun ports, placing trained sailors beside loaded weapons while the approaching steamer still carried families and 6 Confederate artillery pieces. At first, the white cloth was not seen, so the same careful approach that had reassured Confederate sentries now prolonged uncertainty among United States sailors preparing to defend their position. According to the official report, the Onward was preparing to fire when the white flag finally became visible, turning a possible target into people seeking protection within a few critical moments. The planter had survived 2 opposite failures of recognition. Confederate observers saw a routine friendly vessel, while United States sailors saw a possible enemy threat moving toward their guns within minutes. Only when the white cloth could be read did those aboard become legible to the blockade, and the route line finally crossed from deception under slavery into an uncertain claim to freedom. The Onward accepted the vessel, which then moved through the blockading squadron toward Port Royal, carrying people whose legal position had changed faster than the country had meaningfully decided what freedom meant. The United States received the planter 2 mounted guns, 4 transported artillery pieces, ammunition, equipment, recent Charleston newspapers, and a working inventory of Confederate defenses from men who knew them directly firsthand. Flag Officer Samuel DuPont called the intelligence important and asked the government to recognize Robert Smalls and his associates, preserving both military value and the unequal language of official attention. The participants entered category that weakened enslaved, without yet establishing equal national citizenship or lasting secure safety. That crossing did not erase danger, racism, or legal uncertainty, but it changed command over their labor, access to their families, and the choices people aboard could make next. And 3 children. 16 people, a precise contemporary total that most current National Park Service accounts continue to use. Totaling 17 participants, a one-person discrepancy, demonstrating how even this celebrated collective escape entered fundamentally incompatible official records permanently afterward. Governments quickly itemized ship guns, ammunition, and intelligence because those categories already had recognized value, while people appeared through different inconsistent names, job labels, prize shares, military files, pensions, and scattered newspapers. Robert Smalls deserved recognition. The deeper truth is that freedom arrived through a system of families, workers, signals, and shared risk. Our chart ends where the archive branches. Subscribe for more overlooked operations and tell us which history should be reconstructed next, because every completed route still leaves names waiting beyond its edge.